Black CEO told to move from first class minutes later. One call grounded the flight. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You don't belong here. The words rang out across the quiet, luxurious first-class cabin, slicing through the calm like a sharp blade. The white flight attendant's gaze was cold and dismissive as she pointed at the black CEO, who had just boarded the flight in simple attire, aiming for a discreet entrance. The CEO's name, however, was not yet recognized, nor her status. The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, while the air around the CEO thickened with the weight of prejudice. What was supposed to be a routine flight quickly began to unravel as the CEO, calm and composed, silently processed the insult. But what happens next will shock you. Minutes later, one phone call would not only change the trajectory of this flight, but bring down the entire system that tried to silence her. Asterisk, asterisk. Keep watching to see the twist no one saw coming. Asterisk, asterisk. The tension in the cabin escalated when the flight attendant, growing more confident in her authority, demanded that the CEO vacate her seat, despite the clear ticket and ID in hand. The situation grew more heated when the flight's manager was called over. "You can't sit here. We've had issues like this before," he said, a thinly veiled reference to the CEO's race. The subtle mockery was clear to everyone, but the CEO stood firm, not moving a muscle, not flinching, even when security was called. "I belong here," she said quietly, her voice calm, yet laced with an authority that no one in the room could ignore. The flight attendants and manager, visibly shaken, tried to intimidate her, but it was clear they were losing control. The room was watching, the weight of their decision now hanging in the air. Then, she took out her phone and dialed the one number that would make all the difference. Moments later, everything changed. The flight was grounded, and the staff found themselves facing consequences far beyond their understanding. The CEO didn't need to yell or make a scene. Her power lay in something much deeper, and it would resonate long after the plane touched down. This is a story not just about standing up for yourself, but about dismantling a system that has been designed to hold you down. "You don't belong here." The words cut through the air in the first-class cabin, sharp and cold, dripping with dismissive prejudice. The white flight attendant's gaze held no warmth as she looked at the black CEO, who had just boarded the flight in casual attire. There was nothing about her appearance that screamed power, yet there she was, carrying herself with quiet confidence. The passengers around her exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak up until now. The flight attendant's voice was stern as she pointed toward the CEO's seat and said, "You're in the wrong class. Please move." The CEO's heart didn't race. She had heard these words too many times. Calmly, she handed over her ID and ticket. "This is my seat," she said, her voice firm but unshaken. But the attendant was having none of it. The tension in the cabin grew as the flight's manager was called over. He didn't even look at her ID, dismissing her as another person who didn't belong. "You can't sit here," he told her flatly. "We've had issues like this before." The racial undertones were impossible to ignore, and for a moment, the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. The CEO didn't argue. Instead, she stood tall, her presence undeniable. "I belong here," she said, looking directly at him. And with that, she pulled out her phone. What followed next shocked everyone in the cabin. She didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She made one call, and within minutes, the entire flight was grounded. The staff, who had assumed their authority would crush her, now found themselves caught in a whirlwind they hadn't anticipated. The flight manager, who had tried to undermine her, now stood at the back of the plane, powerless. The CEO didn't need to scream to make her point. Her actions spoke louder than any words. And when the plane eventually landed, the consequences would unfold, leaving everyone on board wondering, how could they have underestimated her so completely? As the flight settled into its cruise, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some still unsure about what had just transpired. The Black CEO, Vanessa Clark, sat in her seat, her calm demeanor undisturbed. The flight attendants, who moments ago had tried to humiliate her, now avoided eye contact, feeling the weight of their actions. The manager, who had initially dismissed her, was now nervously making his way down the aisle, avoiding her gaze at all costs. The plane had barely left the ground when the first signs of change began to show. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she saw the name of her executive assistant, Carla Evans. Protocol 6 is in place. The message read. Carla had already initiated the chain of events that would soon unravel everything. Vanessa's call had done more than ground the flight. It had set in motion a series of corporate protocols that would shake the very foundation of Summit Enterprises. No one in the cabin knew it yet, but this would be the last flight for the manager and the flight attendants who had humiliated her. In the meantime, Vanessa did nothing. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence alone was enough to send a message that no one dared ignore. The passengers, who had witnessed the altercation, were slowly beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. Some were still shocked. Others had already begun to applaud her silently. Vanessa felt the eyes of the room on her, but she remained composed, her gaze unwavering. She had been here before disrespected, underestimated, and judged by people who had no idea who she truly was. But now, she wasn't just a passenger. She was a force to be reckoned with. The flight continued, but Vanessa's thoughts were already moving ahead to the next steps. She knew what had to be done. She had built Summit Enterprises from the ground up, and this was just the beginning of exposing the deep-seated biases that had taken root within the company. She wasn't just going to change this flight or this moment. She was going to change the system. As the hours passed and the plane flew on, Vanessa's mind was focused. She had made her move, and now the game was set. The system that had allowed this kind of discrimination to thrive would soon be dismantled. With every mile that passed, the stakes grew higher, and for the flight crew, their fate had already been sealed. As the flight continued its journey, Vanessa remained calm, her mind focused on the inevitable outcome that would follow. She could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere as the crew began to realize the magnitude of their mistake. The once confident flight attendants were now quietly huddled in the back, their whispers barely audible over the low hum of the engine. They had no idea what they had triggered, but Vanessa did. She had been in this position before, but this time it was different. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Her phone buzzed again. It was Carla, her trusted assistant. "We're escalating," the message read. "Protocol 6 is fully active. HR is on standby. Get ready." Vanessa's heart quickened, but her exterior remained composed. She had set the wheels in motion, and now it was just a matter of waiting. She could already picture what would happen next. Summit Enterprises had an internal process for situations like this, and while most employees would have been oblivious to the procedures in place, Vanessa knew them well. She had crafted them herself. The thought of seeing the crew members who had disrespected her face the consequences of their actions brought a sense of justice. The passengers, some of whom had been quiet observers moments ago, began to shift in their seats, sensing that something was about to change. A few of them exchanged knowing glances, others whispered in hushed tones, clearly aware that the CEO was not a typical passenger. They had witnessed the subtle abuse of power by the crew, and now they were about to witness the fall of those who thought they could get away with it. Vanessa looked around the cabin, noticing the passengers who had seen the injustice unfold. There were the older woman who had glanced at her with sympathy earlier, the young man who had stood up for her when the flight attendants questioned her presence, and a few others who seemed to recognize the situation for what it was. They had all become part of this silent revolt, whether they realized it or not. Time seemed to slow as the plane flew on, the distance between its departure and its destination symbolizing the emotional distance that Vanessa had already crossed. As the flight neared its midway point, the crew members who had been so confident in their authority were no longer walking with the same posture. Their heads were down, their movements slow and unsure. Vanessa knew that they were beginning to understand that they had overstepped their bounds, but it was too late for apologies. They had already crossed the line. Vanessa checked her watch. mentally calculating the time it would take for everything to unfold. The plane was flying on autopilot now, both literally and metaphorically, and in just a few hours, the actions of a few would be answered by a powerful shift in the corporate structure that had enabled this behavior. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been treated the same way, everyone who had been pushed to the side because they didn't fit a certain image. The fight was bigger than this flight, bigger than this one moment. It was about systemic change, and Vanessa was about to make sure that change would happen. As the plane continued its course, Vanessa remained in her seat, unmoving, yet her mind was anything but still. Her phone buzzed once more, this time with a message from Carla. The escalation is complete. HR is pulling their records now. Vanessa's heart raced with anticipation, but she kept her calm exterior. The words from the flight attendant still echoed in her mind, the dismissive tones, the unspoken biases that had tainted every interaction. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about exposing the layers of discrimination that had been buried beneath the surface of Summit Enterprises for far too long. As the hours passed, the flight attendants began to move with a different energy. There was no more arrogance in their steps, no more smugness in their glances. Instead, they walked slowly, their eyes avoiding Vanessa's. She could see the fear beginning to take hold, the realization creeping in that the system they thought they were protected by was starting to break down. Vanessa could almost feel the shift in the air, the discomfort rising as the truth began to settle in. The passengers, many of whom had been silent witnesses up until this point, were beginning to speak in hushed tones. Whispers of disbelief and quiet support spread through the cabin. One older man leaned over to a woman seated beside him and murmured, "Did you see that? She's the real deal." I knew something wasn't right. His voice was low, but the words carried, and the woman nodded in agreement. Another passenger, a young woman sitting near the back, stared at Vanessa with a mix of awe and admiration. Vanessa didn't acknowledge them directly. She didn't need to. The subtle shift in energy was enough. It was clear to everyone on board that this was no ordinary flight. It wasn't just about getting from one destination to another anymore. It was about witnessing a pivotal moment in time. As the crew continued to glance nervously around the cabin, waiting for something to happen, Vanessa's mind was focused on the bigger picture. The flight might be just a small part of her day, but this moment, this very moment, was going to be a turning point. She thought back to the years she had spent building Summit Enterprises, the countless battles she had fought to get to the top, and how those battles had always been harder because of the color of her skin. She had been underestimated, pushed aside, and treated as though she didn't belong in spaces where her presence should have been expected. But today, on this flight, things were different. She wasn't just going to let the small, everyday slight slide. Today, she was making a statement not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or inferior. Vanessa knew that she had already won this battle. It was no longer about the flight attendants or the flight manager. It was about making sure that every person who had ever been treated unjustly would feel the weight of her actions long after this flight was over. With every passing minute, she felt more certain that this was the moment that would start a ripple effect, one that would echo through Summit Enterprises and beyond. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an alert from Carla. HR has the files, and the audit is in motion. It's happening. Vanessa nodded to herself, her mind made up. The system was about to change, and she was the one leading the charge. The minutes stretched on as the plane soared higher, but Vanessa's focus never wavered. She felt the slight hum of the engines beneath her, a steady rhythm that mirrored the beat of her thoughts. The passengers were more aware now, their whispers turning into open conversation. The mood in the cabin had shifted from confusion to recognition, and Vanessa could feel it. The flight attendants had become increasingly nervous, avoiding eye contact, their movements sluggish and uncertain. The tension between them and the CEO was palpable, the once unshakable confidence in their authority now replaced by hesitation. It wasn't just the flight crew that was feeling the pressure. Even the manager, who had been so quick to dismiss her, seemed to shrink with every passing moment. As he walked down the aisle, trying to maintain some semblance of control, his eyes flickered toward Vanessa, but he quickly looked away, as though afraid to meet her gaze. He could feel the shift happening. His power was slipping, and he had no idea how to get it back. The moment was coming. Vanessa's mind raced, but her demeanor remained unshaken. She had already set the wheels in motion. The protocol she had initiated wasn't just about punishing a few arrogant flight attendants. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed people like them to thrive unchecked. Vanessa wasn't going to let them hide behind the walls of their institution any longer. The time had come for them to face the consequences of their actions. As the plane flew on, Vanessa's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. She thought about the years of struggle, the countless instances of being dismissed, undermined, and belittled simply because of her race. This wasn't just a personal fight for her. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been treated as less than. For every person who had been told they didn't belong. For every person whose worth had been questioned based on the color of their skin. Vanessa knew she had to take action. She was determined to make sure this moment wasn't forgotten. The stakes were higher than just this flight or this incident. It was about changing the narrative for good. She glanced around the cabin, observing the passengers who had silently witnessed everything. Some had started to shift in their seats, their discomfort turning into quiet support. It wasn't just the people who had spoken up, like the young man who had stepped in to defend her earlier. It was everyone who could feel the injustice in the air. For the first time in a long while, Vanessa felt that the momentum was truly in her favor. The CEO didn't need to shout or wave her arms to demand respect. All she had to do was stand her ground and let her actions speak for themselves. And as she sat there, the power that had been taken from her countless times before was now fully in her hands. The flight continued, but the path had already been set. The flight attendants, the manager, and everyone else on board were about to learn the hard way that there would be no more tolerance for the kind of discrimination they had displayed. And when the plane finally touched down, the world would know that Vanessa Clark had taken control not just of her seat, but of the situation. The story of this flight was just beginning. The flight continued its journey through the skies, but Vanessa remained rooted in the moment. It wasn't just about the altitude or the miles between destinations anymore. It was about power, the kind of power that had been stripped away from her for years, the kind she was finally reclaiming. The subtle shifts in the cabin became more apparent as time passed. The flight attendants, who had been so quick to assert their authority earlier, were now barely holding it together. They whispered to each other in the back, avoiding eye contact with Vanessa, aware that every word and every movement was being scrutinized. The manager, who had initially dismissed her, had now taken on the role of a nervous observer. He walked down the aisle again, but this time his steps were slower, more calculated. He seemed to be looking for a way out, a way to avoid the inevitable confrontation that was coming. Vanessa watched him, unbothered. She knew exactly what was happening. He and the entire crew were beginning to understand that they had crossed a line, one they couldn't simply erase with a polite apology. They had made their move, and now it was her turn to make hers. Vanessa checked her watch and saw that the plane had reached its cruising altitude. The crew's anxiety had escalated, and she could feel the pressure building. The passengers around her, once quiet, were starting to murmur to each other. There was an unspoken understanding among them now. They were witnessing something far bigger than a simple confrontation over a seat. They were witnessing a shift, a moment of reckoning that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about power, race, and justice. Vanessa sat back in her seat, her gaze unwavering, her posture calm. She could feel the weight of her own resolve pressing down on her shoulders. This was no longer about the plane, the crew, or even the passengers. This was about dismantling the systems that perpetuated inequality, the systems that allowed people to think they could treat others as less than. And Vanessa knew that this was just the beginning. As her phone buzzed again with a message from Carla, everything's in place. The audit will begin when we land. She couldn't help but smile. She had done it. The wheels were in motion, and no one could stop it now. The flight attendants and the manager could try to save face, but the truth was clear. They had lost their control, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Vanessa was no longer just a passenger on this plane. She was the one who would change its course, and everyone aboard would know it. As the plane soared higher, Vanessa's calm exterior remained unshaken, but inside, she could feel the building momentum. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an update from Carla. Internal team is reviewing the situation. They flagged the crew. It's official. Vanessa let out a slow breath, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over her. She had set the plan into motion, and now there was no turning back. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension, the once serene hum of the flight now replaced by the unmistakable hum of nervous energy. The flight attendants had gathered in the back, their faces pale, whispering amongst themselves. They had no idea what was coming, but Vanessa did. She had seen this before. People in power, holding on to it with everything they had, terrified of losing control. She had been the one they underestimated, the one they belittled, but now it was their turn to face the consequences. The manager, still trying to maintain some semblance of authority, walked up and down the aisle, his steps heavy, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. He avoided Vanessa's gaze as he passed, knowing that the moment had passed for him to fix things. There was no apology that could undo what had been done. The passengers, who had been silent observers, now seemed to feel the weight of the moment as well. Vanessa could see their eyes shifting from the crew to her, then back to the crew, as if they were silently weighing the situation. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to understand, and a few even nodded subtly in her direction. She wasn't just the CEO of Summit Enterprises. She was a symbol of something bigger. She was the person who would hold the system accountable. The flight continued, but it was no longer just about a simple journey to a destination. It was about a journey toward change. As the plane cruised above the clouds, the crew's anxiety became more evident. They began to whisper, speaking in hushed tones, eyes constantly flickering toward Vanessa. She could see the uncertainty in their movements, the way they shifted from foot to foot, as if they were trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation. But the truth had already been set into motion. The CEO had called the shots, and now they would have to pay the price for their arrogance. Vanessa glanced out the window, her mind already 5 steps ahead. This was just the beginning. She was going to make sure that the changes she was about to set in motion would not be ignored. The system would be held accountable, and no one, least of all the flight attendants who had tried to humiliate her, would get away with it. Her message was clear. Discrimination, no matter how subtle, would no longer be tolerated. When this flight landed, it would be a new day, not just for Vanessa, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. She was ready to finish this, and no one would stop her. The seatbelt sign blinked on as the captain announced their descent, but the silence inside the cabin was louder than the engines outside. Every passenger could feel it, the tension, the weight of what was about to happen. Vanessa sat still, eyes forward, calm as ever. Her phone buzzed once more. It was Carla. "Vanessa, the executive board has been briefed. The flight crew's actions are being reviewed in real time. Do you want me to proceed with the public incident report?" Vanessa typed back a single word: "Proceed." She placed her phone on the tray table and folded her hands neatly on top of it. Her expression did not change, but her resolve was absolute. The manager, clearly unaware of the storm gathering outside the cabin walls, approached her once again, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Ma'am, I just want to clarify, there's been a misunderstanding. Vanessa looked up slowly, her gaze cutting him off mid-sentence. "A misunderstanding?" she said quietly. "You tried to remove me from my seat, confiscated my ticket, and called security before confirming a single fact. That is not a misunderstanding. That is discrimination." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. Every person within earshot turned their head, and the cabin went dead quiet. The manager swallowed hard, his lips parting but no words coming out. He stood frozen, caught between denial and regret. Vanessa's phone buzzed again. Another message from Carla appeared. "Ground control has been notified. The incident report will go public once we land. HR has issued preliminary terminations." Vanessa locked her screen and said calmly, "Thank you." The young flight attendant who had stood behind the manager earlier now looked visibly shaken, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She whispered, "I did not mean for it to go that far." Vanessa turned her gaze toward her, but remained silent. She had heard that phrase before from board members, from executives, from people who claimed innocence after harm was done. "Intent does not erase impact," she said finally, her tone even but cutting. The attendant's face fell as she stepped back. Around them, the passengers were whispering, phones discreetly raised. A man in a business suit said quietly to the woman beside him, "She's the CEO. I saw her on Forbes last year." The woman nodded, her eyes wide. "That's her? No wonder she's so calm." The truth was spreading faster than anyone could stop it. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her gaze fixed ahead. The moment had come full circle. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on her was about to become their undoing. The manager took one hesitant step back, his voice small and desperate now. "Please, Miss Clark, if we could just talk privately." Vanessa interrupted him without raising her tone. "You had your chance to talk privately when you first saw me. You chose to talk publicly, to humiliate me publicly. So now, we will finish this publicly." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. The plane began its descent through the clouds, but inside the cabin, the temperature had changed completely. There was no more arrogance, no more denial, only the quiet realization that this was the end of their authority. Vanessa picked up her phone once more and sent one final message. "Activate full disciplinary protocol upon landing." The screen dimmed, and for the first time, the manager seemed to understand exactly who he had been dealing with. The plane touched down, but for the crew, the fall had already begun. The wheels touched the ground with a soft thud, but the silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and oblivious to the tension filling the first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off." The polite announcement felt almost absurd against the backdrop of what had just unfolded. Vanessa stayed seated, calm and deliberate, as the plane taxied toward the gate. Her phone vibrated once more, lighting up with Carla's name. The message was short and precise. "Ground team ready. Local HR and legal are waiting. News outlets have picked up the internal memo." Vanessa exhaled quietly and typed, "Confirm termination on arrival." She slipped her phone into her bag and waited. The flight attendants gathered near the galley, whispering frantically. One of them, the same woman who had questioned Vanessa's seat at the start of the flight, was visibly shaking. "Do you think she'll really do it?" she asked under her breath. The manager, red-faced and sweating, muttered, "She wouldn't dare. Not here, not now." But even he didn't sound convinced. The passengers had started pulling out their phones, pretending to scroll, though most were recording. The atmosphere was electric, like the seconds before a storm breaks. When the seatbelt sign finally went off, Vanessa stood. Every movement she made was deliberate, steady. She turned, facing the manager and the crew. "Before you all rush to open the doors," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the air, "you should know that this flight will not be deplaning as usual." The murmurs stopped instantly. The manager blinked. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice cracking. Vanessa stepped closer, her posture commanding but never aggressive. "This flight is grounded for investigation under Summit Enterprises' corporate travel policy. Every minute of what happened here has been logged and transmitted to headquarters. That includes your actions, your words, and your attempts to cover them." The manager opened his mouth to argue, but the intercom beeped overhead. The captain's voice came back, confused but professional. "Miss Clark, we've just received notice from Summit Control. We've been asked to hold position at the gate until clearance from your office." The gasps that rippled through the cabin were immediate. The passengers exchanged looks, some whispering, others simply staring at Vanessa with awe. The truth was now undeniable. The flight attendants turned pale, and the manager's shoulders sagged as the reality sank in. Vanessa gave a small nod toward the cockpit. "Thank you, Captain. Please comply with the instruction." She then turned to the manager one last time. "You tried to remove me from my seat, to strip me of my dignity, without a single fact to stand on. Now, you will face the consequences publicly, just as you chose to humiliate me publicly." Her words carried no anger, only truth. The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. His authority was gone. Vanessa's phone buzzed again, and she read the message silently. "Confirmed. Crew suspended pending full review. Public statement live." She looked up, her tone even. "You can collect your belongings and wait in the terminal. Security will escort you once the investigators arrive." The plane doors remained closed. The passengers sat silently, some still recording, others too stunned to move. And as Vanessa turned back to her seat, a quiet round of applause began from somewhere behind her. It grew slowly, spreading through the cabin, until the sound filled the air completely. Vanessa did not smile, but her eyes softened. Justice had landed, and the world was watching. The plane came to a stop at the gate, but the atmosphere inside the cabin felt anything but finished. Vanessa sat back in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed the crew, still in stunned silence. The flight attendants had already gathered their belongings, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with tension. The manager, who had been so certain of his authority just hours ago, was now hunched over, a shadow of the confident figure he had been. Vanessa knew what was coming next. As the last of the passengers disembarked, she stood up and made her way toward the exit, her posture as composed as ever. But just as she reached the door, she paused and turned back to the crew. The moment hung in the air, and the crew braced themselves. Vanessa didn't shout, didn't make any dramatic gestures she didn't need to. Her voice, when it came, was steady and commanding. "You've all been removed from this flight's records," she said, her eyes locking with the manager's. "You will not be working another flight for Summit Enterprises again, not under my watch." The manager's face drained of color, and he opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Vanessa's gaze shifted to the flight attendants. "The internal audit will review your actions. As of now, your future with this company is in question." The crew stood frozen, their eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and disbelief. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the plane's systems, still running. Then, as if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle. 2 security guards appeared at the front of the plane, their presence making it clear that the situation was no longer in their hands. Vanessa nodded to them as they stepped forward. "Please escort these individuals to the terminal for processing," she said, her voice unwavering. The security guards nodded and moved to intercept the crew, who were now visibly shaken. "You can't just do this," the manager muttered weakly, but Vanessa didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was that his words no longer held weight. The consequences of his actions had already been set into motion, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the security guards led the crew off the plane, Vanessa turned and walked down the jet bridge, the sound of the applause still ringing in her ears. The passengers had quietly watched the entire ordeal unfold, and now, as the doors closed behind her, she could hear the soft hum of their approval. It wasn't just the fact that she had stood up for herself. It was the fact that she had done something they had all silently wished they could do: hold people in power accountable. As she stepped into the terminal, her phone buzzed once more. A message from Carla. "The company's statement is live. All social media channels are picking it up. The flight attendants are trending." Vanessa smiled to herself as she read the words. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had sent a message, loud and clear. This would not be tolerated. Discrimination, bigotry, and abuse of power, none of it would be swept under the rug anymore. Not while she had a say. And she wasn't finished yet. Vanessa walked through the terminal, her pace steady but purposeful. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the polished floors, a rhythmic reminder of how much had shifted in just a few hours. She felt the weight of the moment settle in, but there was no time for reflection, not yet. As she made her way toward the exit, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was an alert from Carla. "Media outlets are requesting interviews. The company's board is awaiting your next steps." Vanessa smiled faintly, knowing that the events of the day had sparked more than just a corporate shakeup. They had ignited something much larger. She was well aware that the flight crew's humiliating behavior would not be the only thing discussed in the media. The entire structure of the system they worked in would come under scrutiny. She had planned it this way. The moment she had made that call to ground the flight, she knew it would go public. The whole world would be watching, and she was ready for it. As she stepped into the car waiting outside, her assistant Carla's voice came through the phone's speaker, calm but urgent. "Vanessa, the media is asking for a statement from you. The board wants to know how you want to proceed." Vanessa leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed ahead. "Tell them to issue the statement," she said, her voice steady. "I'll handle the rest." She had spent years building Summit Enterprises from the ground up, enduring countless challenges along the way, each one more grueling than the last. But today, everything had changed. This wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about creating a ripple effect that would change how discrimination was dealt with, not only within her company, but across industries. The ride to her office was short, but it gave Vanessa a chance to collect her thoughts. She wasn't just the CEO of Summit Enterprises anymore. She was the embodiment of change, the face of accountability, and she intended to make sure that everyone knew it. As she arrived at her building, the doors were immediately opened for her, and she stepped out into the lobby. The atmosphere inside was charged, as if the entire office had been waiting for her return. Carla met her by the elevator, handing her a tablet with the latest reports. "The team is ready for the internal review to begin," she said. Vanessa glanced at the screen briefly, then nodded. "Let's get started. We're going to do things differently now. There will be no more tolerance for bias, no more excuses. Today marks the end of one system and the beginning of another." As the elevator doors closed behind them, Vanessa felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just fixing the broken parts of her company, she was fixing the entire system. And nothing, no one, was going to stop her. As Vanessa entered her office, the weight of the day finally began to settle in. The adrenaline from the flight, the phone calls, the decisions, all of it had built up to this moment. She took a deep breath, looking around at the sleek, minimalist space she had worked so hard to create. It was her sanctuary, her domain, and today, it would become the center of a new wave of change. Carla stood by the desk, holding a folder of the latest updates. "The press conference is scheduled for later today," she said, her voice steady. "We've already drafted the key talking points. The legal team is on standby if we need to address any backlash." Vanessa nodded, her mind racing with the next steps. "We don't need to worry about backlash," she said calmly. "The truth is on our side. What we need to do now is make it clear that this isn't just about one flight crew or one incident. This is about a systemic problem that affects too many people in our company and in this industry." She took the folder from Carla and flipped through it quickly, her gaze sharp. "I want the press to hear it from me first. I'm not just issuing a statement, I'm starting a movement." Carla nodded, fully in sync with Vanessa's vision. She had been with Vanessa since the beginning, helping her build Summit Enterprises, and she knew that today marked the beginning of something bigger than just business. It was about changing the way people thought, the way companies operated, and the way society treated those who were often pushed aside. Vanessa stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the skyline. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. "But I'm not just going to change Summit Enterprises. I'm going to change how we hold people accountable across the board. I've been silent for too long. Now, it's time for everyone else to hear us. We need to build a new system, one where justice isn't an afterthought, one where discrimination isn't swept under the rug." She turned back to Carla. "Make the announcement. Let them know we're not backing down." Carla smiled, her expression filled with pride. "It's already in motion. Everyone will hear about this." As the room filled with the hum of activity, Vanessa's phone buzzed once again. It was a notification from the media. The story was already going viral. The flight attendant's termination, the company's new stance on zero tolerance for discrimination, and the global conversation that had been sparked were already taking shape. Vanessa smiled, a sense of pride and purpose swelling inside her. The change had already begun, and it was going to spread. As she sat down to prepare for the press conference, she knew this moment would mark the turning point for not just Summit Enterprises, but for an entire industry, and, hopefully, for a society that was ready to listen.